After my wife and son betrayed me, I cut off all contact for 5 years, changed my number, left Boston, and rebuilt my life alone in Seattle. Then one afternoon, my head of operations walked into my office, placed his phone on my desk, and said nothing. On the lobby camera, I saw her silver hair perfect tears, 3 journalists waiting behind her. I had not seen her in 5 years. But the moment I saw the cameras, I knew one thing: this was not a reunion. It was a performance. If you made it past that opening, thank you truly. Now tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? City, country, time zone? Leave it below. You would be surprised how far this reaches. This story weaves in fictional elements for storytelling and educational depth. Names and locations are coincidental. The message, however, is entirely intentional. The elevator took 40 seconds to reach the lobby. I counted every one of them. George Tabor, my head of operations. The man who had been with me since the second year of Holt Dynamics had not said a single word when he walked into my office and set his phone on my desk. He had simply turned the screen toward me and stepped back. George had worked for me long enough to know that some information lands harder when it arrives without commentary. The lobby camera feed showed a woman standing at the center of the marble floor, with the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed their entrance. She was dressed in a cream blouse and dark slacks. Her silver hair swept back in a way that suggested effort disguised as effortlessness. 3 men stood nearby with cameras and recording equipment, journalists, or something close enough to the word that the distinction barely mattered. I recognized her the moment the image loaded. My chest did not tighten. My hands did not shake. What I felt was something closer to the sensation of a long calculation finally reaching its final number. Vivienne Holt had found me. I straightened my jacket, rolled my shoulders once, and told George to prepare the press statement we had drafted 3 weeks earlier, the one titled Estranged Family Reunion, and to have it ready for distribution within the hour. He nodded, picked up his phone, and moved toward the door. George, I said. He stopped. She brought cameras. That means this is a performance, which means ours needs to be better. He gave me the short, precise nod of a man who understood exactly what was being asked of him. Then he was gone, and I stepped into the elevator. When the doors opened to the lobby, Vivienne turned toward me with the speed of someone who had been watching the elevator panel the entire time. Her eyes filled with tears so quickly it almost looked genuine. Almost. Desmond. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. She crossed the floor toward me with her arms already open, and I had perhaps 3 seconds to decide what kind of man I was going to be in front of those cameras. I chose the man who opens his arms back. Vivienne, I said, and let her walk into the embrace. Over her shoulder, I watched one of the cameramen step forward to get a tighter shot. Behind Vivienne, a few steps back, stood Garrett, my son. 27 years old, thinner than I remembered, wearing a work jacket that had clearly seen better days. His eyes were not on me. They were moving across the lobby in slow, systematic sweeps. The front desk, the security station, the corridors leading to the elevators, the height of the ceilings. He was not looking for his father. He was pricing the room. Vivienne pulled back and held my face in both hands. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. Her eyes, however, were dry at the corners, the particular dryness of someone who had applied glycerin drops rather than cried their way into a car. I had been married to this woman for 20 years. I knew the difference between her grief and her theater. 5 years, she whispered loud enough for the nearest microphone. I looked everywhere, Desmond. I never stopped looking. I know, I said, and kept my voice warm and hated how easily the warmth came. One of the journalists stepped forward. Mr. Holt, can you speak to how this reunion came about? I turned to the camera with the practiced ease of a man who had given 100 press interviews and said, "Family finds a way. That's all I'll say for now. We have a lot of catching up to do." I smiled. The journalist smiled. Vivienne dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief she had produced from nowhere, the way magicians produce scarves. George appeared at my elbow and began politely redirecting the journalists toward a prepared statement at the front desk, offering them official quotes and professionally lit photographs. Within 4 minutes, the lobby was clear of cameras. Garrett finally approached. He extended his hand and I shook it. His grip was firm, deliberate, the grip of someone who had practiced it. I looked down at his palm as our hands met. Calluses along the base of the fingers, thick and genuine looking, but the fingertips were smooth. A man who truly spent months doing warehouse labor, lifting, stacking, gripping, would have rough skin from the knuckle down. Garrett stopped at exactly the wrong place. "Dad," he said. His voice was steady, but his jaw was working slightly the way a jaw works when the words underneath the words are fighting to get out. It's good to see you. Like you too, son. I said and meant neither word. We took the elevator upstairs. Vivienne stood beside me and looked straight ahead at the brushed steel doors. I could feel the performance recalibrating in real time, the tearful wife stepping aside to make room for whoever she was planning to be next. The transition was smooth. I had to give her that. The conference room on the 40th floor had a view of Elliott Bay on clear days. Today, a low marine layer had settled over the water, turning everything soft and gray and indistinct. Vivienne sat down across from me, folded her hands on the table, and tilted her head at the angle people use when they are about to deliver news they have been rehearsing. "There's something you need to know," she said, "about my health." Her hand moved to her bag. She pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table between us and slid it toward me with 2 fingers, the way you slide something across a table when you want it to look reluctant. I looked at the folder. I looked at her face. The tears were gone now. In their place was something quieter and more deliberate, the expression of a woman who has decided that vulnerability deployed correctly is the sharpest tool in the room. I reached out and opened the folder. The folder contained 12 pages. The first page was a cover letter from something called Cascade Valley Medical Associates, printed on heavy cream stock, with a logo that looked expensive and authoritative. The letterhead listed an address in Bellevue, Washington. The second page was a diagnosis summary: Stage 3 ovarian cancer confirmed by biopsy, prognosis guarded. The remaining pages were test results, lab panels, imaging reports, all of them formatted with the careful precision of documents that wanted very badly to appear official. I read every page. I took my time. I let Vivienne watch me read, because watching someone read something you have fabricated is its own kind of torture, and I saw no reason to rush her relief. When I finished, I set the last page down and looked at her across the table. Her lower lip trembled, her hands folded on the table pressed together until the knuckles whitened. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said softly. "I didn't come here for money, Desmond. I want you to know that. I needed to see you before things get worse. I needed to know that somewhere, somehow, you didn't hate me." Her voice broke on the last word. It was a beautiful break, controlled, credible landing exactly where it was designed to land. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. I let my shoulders drop. I let my face do the thing that faces do when a man is being moved by something, and I said, "I don't hate you, Vivienne. I never hated you." She pressed her fingertips to her mouth. Her eyes glistened. "I've made so many mistakes," she whispered. "So many things I can't take back." "We both have," I said. That part was true. I let the truth do the work so I wouldn't have to. What I did not tell her was what I had already noticed in those 12 pages. The address for Cascade Valley Medical Associates listed a suite number on the 4th floor of a building I knew well, a commercial property in Bellevue that Holt Dynamics had evaluated for office expansion 18 months ago. At the time of our evaluation, floors 3 through 5 were vacant, and more importantly, the physician whose signature appeared on the diagnosis summary, a Dr. R. Callahan, did not appear in the Washington State Medical Commission's online physician look-up a database I had checked on my phone under the table while appearing to read page 7. The documents were well made. Someone had put real effort and real money into them. But a man who has spent 30 years checking tolerances and stress points in mechanical systems develops a particular reflex for finding the place where something does not quite fit. I told Vivienne that I needed a day to process everything. I told her she and Garrett were welcome to stay at the house in Medina while she was in Seattle for treatment. I told her the guest rooms were comfortable and that she should not worry about anything. She reached across the table and gripped my hand with both of hers, and her grip was warm and trembling, and she said, "Thank you, Desmond. You have no idea what this means to me." I squeezed her hand back and told her it was the least I could do. After she left, I sat at the conference table for exactly 3 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called Bennett Cross. Bennett Cross had been my personal attorney for 4 years, a compact, precise man in his early 50s who spoke the way careful people write, choosing each word with the deliberate economy of someone who charged by the hour and respected the rate. I had found him through Marcus Elroy, who had described him as the kind of lawyer who wins by being the most prepared person in every room he enters. In 4 years, I had not found reason to disagree. "I need you to run a verification on a medical document," I said when he answered. "Physician name, clinic address, license number, and I need it today." "And send it over," Bennett said. "Anything else?" "Yes, I need you to start preparing some paperwork of your own. I'll explain the full scope when I come in tomorrow morning. What I can tell you now is that this is going to require absolute discretion and a very particular kind of patience." There was a brief pause on the line. Bennett Cross was not a man who paused often. When he did, it meant he was already thinking 3 moves ahead. "How complicated are we talking?" "Complicated enough that I want 3 independent teams reviewing everything before a single document gets signed." "I'll clear my morning," he said, and that was that. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Bennett called back. His voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering information he finds professionally offensive. "The physician doesn't exist in the Washington State Medical Commission database. The clinic address is a vacant commercial suite in Bellevue. The document formatting is excellent. Whoever made these used real medical software, but the underlying credentials are entirely fabricated." I stood at the window of my office and watched the last of the afternoon light flatten across Elliott Bay. Down on the street, 40 floors below, the city moved in its ordinary way. Cars, pedestrians, the slow crawl of a delivery truck making a turn. "Thank you, Bennett," I said. "Desmond." His voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more careful. "How do you want to handle this?" I thought about Vivian sitting across from me at that conference table, her hands trembling with manufactured grief, the folder of beautiful lies arranged just so between us. I thought about Garrett's eyes moving across my lobby, like a man taking inventory. I thought about the guest rooms at the Medina house, where they would be sleeping tonight. "It's for now," I said. "I want to handle it from the inside." Bennett said nothing for a moment. Then, with the measured tone of a lawyer who has learned that some clients know exactly what they are doing, "I'll have everything ready for your morning visit." I set the phone down on my desk. Outside, the marine layer had thickened over the bay until the water was no longer visible, only the gray suggestion of where it might be. I thought about a folder full of lies sitting in a conference room 1 floor below me, and I thought about the particular kind of patience that the next several weeks were going to require. Then I straightened my jacket, picked up my briefcase, and went home to make sure the guest rooms were ready. 3 days after Vivian moved her luggage into the east guest room and Garrett claimed the one beside it, I was sitting at my desk on the 40th floor when George knocked and opened the door without waiting, which was how I knew whoever was behind him mattered. Garrett walked in, wearing a canvas work jacket with a frayed collar, carrying a paper coffee cup from the diner 2 blocks down. He had lost weight since I last saw him 5 years ago, the kind of weight that comes off a man gradually when he stops eating well and starts sleeping poorly. His jaw was sharper. His eyes were careful in the way that eyes get careful when they have learned that rooms contain more information than people let on. "I wasn't sure you'd see me," he said, stopping a few feet from the desk. "Sit down, Garrett." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the paper cup and looked at it for a moment before looking at me. "I've been working at a distribution warehouse in Soto for the past 8 months, he said, "loading and unloading freight, early shifts. It's not much, but—" He stopped, swallowed. "I'm not here to ask you for anything. I just needed to say that I know what I did. I know what we both did, and I'm sorry, that's all. Just, I'm sorry, Dad." His voice cracked on the last word in a way that sounded entirely real. I studied his face carefully, looking for the place where the performance ended and the person began, and I found it more difficult to locate than I expected. Then I looked down at his hands still wrapped around the paper cup. The calluses were there, thick ridges along the base of each finger, the kind that develop over months of repetitive grip work. But the fingertips themselves were smooth. A man who had spent 8 months loading freight, gripping handles, pulling straps, working in cold warehouse air, would have roughened skin from the knuckle all the way to the tip. Garrett's calluses stopped at exactly the wrong place, like a paint job that covered the front of a wall, but not the sides. I had spent 30 years working with my hands before I ever sat behind a desk. I knew what real labor looked like. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. "It means something." I offered him a position in the Holt Dynamics warehouse division entry level, same as anyone else, no special treatment. He accepted with a gratitude that was either genuine or the finest imitation of it I had ever seen. I walked him out and asked George quietly before returning to my office to keep an eye on Garrett's movements and report anything that seemed worth noting. George gave me the short nod of a man who had already been thinking the same thing. That evening, I drove home to Medina. The house sat at the edge of Lake Washington, a low, modern structure with wide glass panels that caught the last of the day's light and held it longer than it had any right to. I had bought it 2 years after Holt Dynamics went public, not because I needed the space, but because after years of sleeping in a car and a series of rooms that smelled of other people's lives, I had wanted somewhere that felt like it belonged to me completely. Wren was in the kitchen when I came through the back door, standing at the counter with a mug of tea and a stack of project files she had brought home from the office. She was 24 years old, slight, with the kind of watchful stillness that people sometimes mistake for shyness until she opens her mouth. She had been my personal assistant for 2 years, and before that, she had spent 3 years finding me across 4 states with nothing but a name and a stubbornness that still made my chest ache when I thought about it too long. She looked up when I walked in, and something shifted in her expression. Not alarm exactly, but the particular alertness of someone who has learned to read a room through the person entering it. "They're here," she said. It was not a question. "Since Tuesday," I said. "Garrett starts at the warehouse on Monday." She set down her mug with a careful precision that meant she was working to keep her hands from doing something else. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping. "I know what they are. I've always known what they are. Why are you letting them into this house?" I pulled out the stool across from her and sat down. "Because I know exactly what they are," I said. "That's the only reason I let them in, not in spite of it, because of it." She stared at me. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright, with the particular frustration of someone who understands the logic and hates it anyway. And if something goes wrong, then something goes wrong and we deal with it. I reached across the counter and put my hand over hers and felt her fingers tighten around mine for a moment. "But nothing is going to go wrong, not with you here." She pulled in a slow breath through her nose and let it out. "Fine," she said. "But I want to know everything, not summaries. Everything." "Everything," I agreed. I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the back garden toward the lake. The water was dark and flat in the fading light, and standing there, I felt the particular weight of a memory I usually kept at a distance the night, 5 years ago, in Boston, when I had walked out of a house in a snowstorm with a single bag and nothing in my pocket worth counting. Wren had been 19 years old, then living in the spare room of that same house, and she had run out after me into the snow in her socks, calling my name. I had heard her voice carrying across the street, ragged and desperate, cutting through the noise of the wind. But my legs had not stopped. There was nothing left in me that night that knew how to stop. I had kept walking until her voice was gone, and for a long time afterward, the silence where her voice had been was the thing that hurt most. She had found me 3 years later in a parking structure in South Seattle on a Tuesday morning in February. Standing next to a rusted engine block I was trying to coax back to life. She had walked up behind me and said, "I've been looking for you for a long time," and I had turned around and seen her face, and something in my chest that had been closed for 3 years cracked open all at once. I never let her out of my sight after that. Behind me, I heard Vivian's voice drifting down from upstairs, light conversational, addressing someone on the phone. The sound of it moved through the house like smoke finding the gaps under doors. I turned back from the window. "George is going to send me footage from the security cameras tonight," I said. "I want you to watch it with me." Wren picked up her mug of tea with both hands, and over the rim, her eyes were steady and clear. "What are we looking for?" "Whatever they don't want us to see," I said. The footage arrived at 10:47 that night, and what we found in it made my jaw tighten in a way it had not tightened in a long time. The footage showed Garrett moving through the house at 11:23 at night. Wren and I watched it together on my laptop at the kitchen table, the screen casting pale light across both our faces. In the footage, Garrett moved through the hallways with his phone held low and angled slightly upward, the posture of someone taking photographs without wanting to look like they were taking photographs. He paused at the doorway of my study. He pushed the door open, slowly checked the corridor behind him in both directions, and stepped inside. He was in there for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. When he came out, his phone went back into his pocket and his face resumed its careful blankness. He walked back to his room and closed the door without a sound. Wren's jaw was so tight I could see the muscle working in her cheek. "He was in your study for 4.5 minutes, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet, the way voices go quiet when the speaker is working hard to keep them level. "With his phone." "Yeah," I said. "He was photographing everything." She pushed back from the table and stood up, pressing both hands flat against the counter behind her. Her knuckles were white. "Dad, he was mapping the house. He was cataloging your assets." "That's what I believe, yes." She turned to face me, and her eyes were blazing not with tears, but with the particular burning clarity of someone who has just had their worst suspicion confirmed in high definition. "Then we need to call the police, tonight. We have it on camera. We have a man taking photographs in a house where he's been invited to stay," I said. "That's not a crime, Wren, not yet." She opened her mouth and closed it again. Her hands came off the counter and she folded her arms across her chest, and I could see her working through the logic of it, hating each step of the way. "So we wait," she finally said. "We wait," I said, "and while we wait, we build something they can't argue with." The following morning, I drove downtown to the offices of Cross and Associates on 3rd Avenue, where Bennett Cross was waiting for me, with a pot of coffee and the expression of a man who had already read everything I sent him the night before and formed several opinions about it. Bennett Cross was a compact man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested he had never once in his adult life slouched in a chair. He had been my attorney for 4 years, recommended by my business partner, Marcus Elroy, with the description, "He wins because he's always the most prepared person in the room. Hire him before someone else does." I had taken that advice on a Tuesday afternoon and had not regretted it once. He poured 2 cups of coffee and said, without preamble, "Tell me what you need." I told him everything: the fake medical documents, the footage of Garrett mapping the house, the fact that Vivian and I had never legally completed our divorce, a detail I had confirmed with Bennett himself when I first contacted him 4 years ago, at which point he had advised me that the petition filed in Boston in November 2019 had been finalized in March 2020 and was fully enforceable, but that Vivian appeared to be unaware of this. "She thinks she's still your wife," Bennett said. "That she's operating on that assumption," I said, "which means she believes she has a legal claim to the estate if I die without a valid will directing otherwise." Bennett set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of a man organizing his thoughts. "And you want to use that assumption against her. I want to build a trap that closes from the inside," I said. "I want a will legitimate witnessed filed correctly that appears to give her exactly what she came for. And I want a second layer inside, that will that she never sees coming." Bennett leaned back in his chair and looked at me steadily. "A conditional clause. Specific language," I said. "The will stands only if my death occurs by natural causes. If any evidence of harm poisoning or deliberate action to hasten my death is established, the entire estate transfers immediately to a foundation in Wren's name. Every asset, the company, the properties, the accounts, all of it." Bennett was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, I knew, but calculating. "I'll need 3 independent legal reviews before we execute," he said, "and a sign-off from the Washington State Bar on the conditional language. That will take 10 days, maybe 12. "Take the 12, I said. "I want it bulletproof." "There's one more thing you'll need to consider," Bennett said. He leaned forward and folded his hands on the desk. "If you intend to record conversations inside your residence as part of building this case, and I suspect you do, you should know that Washington State is a 2-party consent state for telephone calls, but a 1-party consent state for in-person conversations. As long as you are physically present in the location where the recording occurs, or as long as one consenting party to the conversation is present, the recording is entirely admissible in court. You own the house. You are the consenting party. Anything recorded on your property with you present is legally obtained evidence." I had already known this, but hearing it confirmed by Bennett Cross in his careful, precise voice with his hands folded on his desk made it feel more solid somehow, the way a structure feels more solid when an engineer signs off on it. "Good," I said. "I'll have the will drafted by end of week," Bennett said. "I'll call you when the reviews are complete." I drove back to Medina that afternoon, with the particular calm that settles over a man when the preparation phase of something difficult is finally properly underway. Vivienne was reading in the garden when I arrived, her legs folded beneath her on the outdoor sofa, looking for all the world, like a woman who had come home. I went upstairs to my study. I moved 3 things on my desk, a lamp, a stack of folders, and one particular item, to create a clear, unobstructed surface. Then I set a single document on the center of the desk, angled slightly toward the door. It was a 1-page summary of the will's main provisions printed on Holt Dynamics letterhead. Anyone standing in the doorway would be able to read the key lines without entering the room. That evening, I left the study door open for the first time since Vivienne had moved in. I did not watch the hallway. I did not need to. I heard her footsteps slow as she passed the study on her way to bed, and I heard them stop for a count of 7 before they resumed. 7 seconds was enough to read a page, more than enough. George texted me at 10:58 that night. The message read, "She called Garrett, 41 minutes. I typed back, "Good." I set the phone face down on the nightstand and looked up at the ceiling of my bedroom. The trap was set. The question now was not whether they would take the bait. The question was how long it would take them to decide the risk was worth it and what they would reach for first. I did not have to wait long to find out. 6 days after the 41-minute phone call, Garrett started bringing me tea. Earl Grey every evening at 9 o'clock in a white ceramic mug that he set on my nightstand, with both hands and a smile that sat just slightly too long on his face to be natural. The first night he brought it, I thanked him and told him that was thoughtful. The second night I told him the same thing. By the third night I had begun to understand that the tea was not thoughtfulness. It was architecture. Garrett was building a routine, and routines are useful things when you need someone to consume something at a predictable time every day. On the morning of the fourth day, I woke up and flexed my right hand against the bedsheet. There was a tremor in it, fine, shallow, barely perceptible to anyone who was not paying close attention. But I had been paying close attention to my own hands for 30 years. They were the most reliable instruments I had ever owned, steadier than most machines I had worked on, capable of tolerances that required absolute stillness. This was not fatigue. This was not age. The frequency was wrong, and the pattern was wrong, and every instinct I had developed across 3 decades of mechanical work told me that something external was causing it. I lay still for a long moment and stared at the ceiling and thought about what I knew and what I could prove and what the distance between those two things was going to cost me. Then I got up, showered, dressed, and went downstairs for breakfast as though nothing had happened. That afternoon, while Garrett was at the Holt Dynamics warehouse and Vivian was at what she described as a medical appointment, an appointment I had quietly confirmed through George did not correspond to any clinic in the Seattle area. Just so I went back to my bedroom. I took the mug from the previous evening, which I had not actually drunk from its position behind the nightstand, where I had placed it out of sight. I sealed it in a Ziploc bag I had brought up from the kitchen. I wrote a date and time on the bag in permanent marker. Then I drove to the Holt Dynamics executive parking garage called Marcus Elroy from the car and asked him to meet me. Marcus Elroy was my lead investor and business partner, the man who had made Holt Dynamics possible. He had found me in a machine shop in the Sodo district in early 2021. A 52-year-old man with good hands and a functional prototype of an energy chip that nobody else had thought to build the way I had built it. Marcus had listened to my pitch for 20 minutes, looked at the prototype for another 10, and said, "I'm in." He was 58 years old now, with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had made enough money to stop rushing and enough mistakes to stop being careless. He was also in 4 years of partnership, the most consistently trustworthy person I had encountered outside of Ren. He pulled into the parking garage 12 minutes after I called him and climbed into the passenger seat of my car without being asked. I handed him the Ziploc bag. He looked at it. He looked at me. "How long?" he asked. "Well, 4 days of consumption," I said. "Possibly less. I haven't been drinking all of it." "Smart," he said. Then he held the bag up to the light coming through the windshield and examined the residue at the bottom of the mug. "I know a private lab in Redmond, former military toxicology full panel screening. Completely confidential, no mandatory reporting threshold, unless we're talking about weapons-grade material." He paused. "We're not talking about weapons-grade material, are we?" "I don't believe so," I said, "but I want to know exactly what we are talking about." He nodded and tucked the bag into his jacket pocket. 48 hours, he said. "I'll call you the moment I have results. In the meantime, I began the performance. The following morning, I walked into a staff meeting at Holt Dynamics and called George by the wrong name. Not dramatically, not in a way that caused alarm, but with the mild, slightly embarrassed confusion of a man who had momentarily misplaced a word he used every day. George, to his enormous credit, did not miss a beat. He looked up from his laptop and said, "It's George, sir," in the tone of a patient employee, and moved on. Afterward, in the corridor, he caught my eye for exactly 1 second, one small nod. That was all. At the house, I asked Vivienne twice in the same evening whether she had seen my reading glasses, which were on my face both times. The second time, her hand came up to cover a smile that was not quite a smile. It was sharper than a smile, with more satisfaction underneath it, the expression of someone watching a plan advance on schedule. She told me they were on my face in a voice that was warm and gentle and full of a pity she was almost managing to conceal. "Thank you," I said, and touched my glasses and shook my head at myself. "I don't know where my mind goes sometimes." "It's all right," she said and patted my arm. "That's what I'm here for." My skin crawled under her hand, but I smiled. 47 hours after I handed the mug to Marcus, my phone rang at 6:14 in the morning. I was already awake, sitting in the dark of my study with a cup of actual coffee I had made myself. "There's a compound in that tea." Marcus's voice was low and deliberate, the voice he used when he was being careful about every word. Low concentration, consistent with early-stage neurological suppression, specifically the kind that mimics the onset of age-related cognitive decline, tremor, mild confusion, short-term memory disruption. At this dose, it would take months to cause serious damage. My hand tightened around the coffee cup. Not from fear, from the particular cold fury of having a suspicion confirmed in clinical language. But here is what concerns me more, Marcus continued. This compound is not something you find at a pharmacy. It requires either a chemical background or a very specific supplier. Whoever sourced this knew what they were looking for. Des, this isn't improvised. This is planned. Oh, how long before it becomes dangerous at the current dose? I asked. 3 months, maybe 4, before you'd see significant impairment. But I don't think this is the final dose. He paused and I could hear him choosing the next words with the care of someone diffusing something. I think this is a test. They're measuring the response before they escalate. I set the coffee cup down on the desk. Outside the study window, the first gray light of morning was beginning to separate the lake from the sky. Then we have time, I said. Some, Marcus said. Not unlimited. What do you want to do? I looked at the empty mug from the previous night, the one Garrett had brought up at 9 o'clock, with his careful two-handed delivery and his smile that lasted too long. I had poured it down the bathroom drain, as I had poured every cup since the 4th day, but I had kept it as a sample. I want to keep going, I said. I want them comfortable. I want them certain. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, but Des, the moment the dose changes, you tell me immediately. You'll be the first call I make, I said. I hung up and sat with the information for a while, turning it over in my mind the way I would turn over a mechanical problem, looking at it from every angle, testing the points of stress, looking for where it was most likely to fail. Then I went upstairs, knocked on Wren's door, and when she opened it with sleep-creased cheeks and alarmed eyes, I handed her a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it and read the 4 words I had written there, "Don't react. Trust me." She looked up at me with questions burning in her eyes and her mouth already opening to ask all of them at once. Not here, I said quietly. Not yet, but soon. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of Seattle morning where the clouds sit so low you feel like the sky itself is pressing down on your shoulders. I had barely slept. I lay in bed for 2 hours before sunrise, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible angle of what I was about to do. At 57 years old, I had built an energy company from a single patent sketch drawn on a paper napkin in a Denver motel room. I had survived homelessness, humiliation, and 5 years of starting over from nothing. And now, in my own house under my own roof, the people who had stolen everything from me once were trying to do it again, this time with poison. I was not going to let that happen. By 6:30 in the morning, I was already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table when I heard the soft knock at my office door. Wren stepped in still in her gray sweater, her hair pulled back loosely, her eyes red at the edges. She had not slept either. She set a mug of black coffee in front of me without saying a word, then sat down across the table and looked at me the way she always did when she was waiting for me to say something difficult. "I need to call someone," I said. She nodded. I figured. His name was Harold Finch. He was 63 years old, semi-retired, and the finest precision instrument technician I had ever known. I had first met Harold 12 years ago when Holt Dynamics was still a 2-room operation, and I needed someone to calibrate the sensor array on our first energy chip prototype. Harold had shown up in a flannel shirt and reading glasses, taken one look at the components, and fixed the calibration error in 40 minutes that my entire engineering team had been chasing for 3 weeks. Since then, I had trusted him with things I trusted almost no one else with. I called him at 6:45. He picked up on the second ring. "Desmond," he said, his voice graveled and warm. "It's early." "I need a modification," I said. "Precision work, small housing analog movement. I need it to carry something internal without altering the exterior profile." There was a pause. Harold was not a man who asked unnecessary questions. He understood that when I called at dawn, the request was serious. "Bring it in," he said. "Come through the back." Harold's workshop was a narrow building tucked behind a hardware store in the Georgetown neighborhood of Seattle, about 20 minutes south of the Medina House. The exterior looked like a forgotten storage unit. Inside, it was meticulous wall-mounted pegboards holding tools in perfect order, a long wooden workbench lit by articulated lamps, and the faint smell of machine oil and cedar. I had always loved that smell. It reminded me of the early years when building something with my hands was the only thing that made sense. I placed the pocket watch on the workbench. Harold picked it up, turned it over twice, and opened the case back with a small lever tool. He studied the movement through a loop, his expression neutral and professional. "What are you carrying?" he asked. "Ah, a micro recorder," I said. "Voice activated. I need it seated in the lower cavity without compressing the mainspring, and I need the case to close clean, no visible seam, no weight shift." Harold set the loop down and looked at me over his glasses. Washington State," he said quietly. "One-party consent." "I know the law," I said. He nodded once as if that settled everything. Harold was not a man who judged. He was a man who built things carefully and asked questions only when the answer mattered to the work. The device Harold used was a MEMS microphone, a micro-electromechanical sensor no larger than a grain of rice connected to a flash storage unit the size of a shirt button. When paired with a voice activation threshold circuit, it could record up to 14 hours of clear audio within a 3-meter radius before requiring a data transfer. Harold had sourced similar components before for clients in private security and industrial espionage litigation. Everything he used was commercially available, legally obtained, and documented. He worked in silence for nearly 90 minutes. I sat on a wooden stool beside the bench and watched his hands move with the kind of precision that made me feel for a moment like I was watching something almost peaceful. His fingers did not shake. His breathing was steady. He spoke only once during the entire process when he needed me to confirm the activation and threshold level, and I told him I wanted it sensitive enough to capture a whispered conversation at 4 feet. When he was finished, he closed the case back and handed the watch to me. From the outside, it looked exactly as it always had, the scratched brass housing the worn crown, the faint engraving on the back that read, D.H. Denver, 2019. I had bought it for $8 from a pawn shop on Colfax Avenue the winter I had nothing. I had carried it every day since. Now it was something else entirely. "Transfer cable is inside the band lining," Harold said. "Pull the strap at the second hole and you'll feel it." I slipped the watch onto my wrist and felt the familiar weight of it against my pulse. "Thank you, Harold," I said. He waved one hand without turning around and was already reaching for a different tool before I reached the door. I drove back to Medina in silence. The marine layer had not lifted. The highway curved along the water, and I could see the surface of Lake Washington through the trees flat and dark and still. I thought about Vivienne sitting in the guest room at that moment, probably making phone calls, probably assuming I was grieving or worried or softening. I thought about Garrett in the room next to hers, probably sleeping in the way he always had. I thought about the watch on my wrist. I was no longer waiting for them to make a mistake. I was going to be close enough to record it when they did. I told Wren everything that night, not because I had planned to, not because I had sat down and decided that the time was right or that the moment was appropriate. I told her because when I walked through the front door and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and 3 printed pages of Bennett Cross's preliminary notes spread out in front of her, I understood that she had already figured out most of it on her own. Wren had always been that way, quiet, methodical, reading a room, the way an engineer reads a schematic. She did not need to be told everything. She needed confirmation of what she already suspected. I sat down across from her. I set the watch on the table between us. She looked at it, then looked at me. "Harold," she asked. "Harold," I said. She exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that is not quite relief and not quite fear, but something that lives exactly between the two. Her hands were resting flat on the table, and I noticed they were trembling slightly just at the fingertips, just enough that I could see it if I was looking closely, and I was always looking closely when it came to Wren. I had adopted her when she was 9 years old. She was 24 now. In the 15 years between those two moments, I had watched her grow from a frightened child who flinched at loud voices into a woman who could walk into a boardroom and hold her composure better than people twice her age. But tonight, sitting across from me in the kitchen of a house, surrounded by the people who had once torn our family apart, she looked young again. Not weak, never weak, but young in the way that people look when the weight of something real settles onto them all at once. "Tell me the plan," she said, so I did. I walked her through everything Bennett's legal strategy, the watch modification, the camera feeds George Tabor had quietly extended to cover the East Guest corridor, the preliminary lab analysis of the Earl Grey compounds that my personal physician, Dr. Sandra Merritt, had processed through a private toxicology contact at the University of Washington Medical Center. I told her about the clause Bennett had drafted into the updated estate document, a clause that Vivian did not know existed and would not find until it was far too late to matter. I told her that Detective Ray Dunbar, a 17-year veteran of the King County Major Crimes Unit, who had been quietly brought in by Bennett 3 days earlier, was already reviewing the lab results and building a parallel record. Ray Dunbar was not a man I had met socially. Bennett had recommended him 2 years ago during a corporate espionage matter involving a former Holt Dynamics contractor. Ray was compact, deliberate, and almost pathologically patient, the kind of investigator who would wait 6 months to make an arrest if waiting 6 months meant the case was airtight. When Bennett had first briefed him on the situation, Ray had said 4 words: "Give me the evidence." He had not asked about motive history or emotion. He was interested only in what could be proven. That was exactly the kind of man I needed. Wren listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the legal pad in front of her. Then she picked up her pen and drew a single straight line under the last item on the page. "You're going to need someone inside the house," she said. "Not just cameras, someone who can see things the cameras can't." "I know," I said. "I want to do it," she said. Her voice did not shake when she said it. That was the part that broke something open in my chest quietly without warning, not the words themselves, but the steadiness behind them. She was not asking out of anger or impulse. She had thought it through the same way she thought everything through, and she had arrived at the same conclusion I had been carefully avoiding for the past 48 hours because I did not want to be the kind of father who put his daughter in the path of danger. "Wren," I said, "I've been inside that house before." She said, meaning the years before Boston, the years before everything fell apart. "I know how she operates. I know how Garrett operates. They've never taken me seriously, and they never will. That's an advantage, and we both know it." She was right. I hated that she was right. I sat with it for a long time. Outside, the lights of Medina reflected off the dark surface of Lake Washington, broken and wavering, and the house was completely silent, except for the faint sound of the heating system cycling on. Somewhere down the east corridor behind a closed door, Vivian was sleeping in a bed that I had paid for in a house that I had built from nothing, and she did not yet understand what was waiting for her. I reached across the table and put my hand over Wren's. Her fingers curled around mine and held on the way they had when she was 9 years old and frightened of everything, except that now neither of us was frightened, not exactly. We were something harder than frightened, something quieter and more determined. "You stay close to me," I said. "Any moment something feels wrong, you walk away. No hesitation." "Understood," she said. We sat there at the kitchen table until well past 5 in the morning, going over every detail until there was nothing left to go over. By the time the first pale light came through the east window, the legal pad was full, and the watch was back on my wrist, and Wren had made 2 fresh cups of coffee that neither of us touched. Before we finished that night, I made one more call to Dr. Sandra Merritt. I asked her as a precaution to prepare a small quantity of a fast-acting over-the-counter sleep compound, the kind available in any pharmacy, the kind that metabolizes cleanly and leaves no lasting effect in a healthy adult. I told her it was a contingency. She asked no questions. The following afternoon, she left a small sealed envelope with George at the Holt Dynamics front desk. Wren picked it up on her way home. Neither of us spoke about it again. We simply knew it was there if the moment came. Some plans you make with your mind. This one we made with everything else. 3 days passed without incident, which was the part that made me most uneasy. Vivian was pleasant at breakfast. She complimented the house, asked thoughtful questions about Holt Dynamics, and twice mentioned her medical condition, with the practiced restraint of someone who had rehearsed how much restraint to show. Garrett was less careful. He ate too much, watched the walls too closely, and laughed at things that were not funny. But he was quiet enough that a person not paying attention might have mistaken him for simply awkward rather than calculating. I paid attention to everything. I wore the watch every day. On the third evening, I excused myself early from dinner, citing fatigue, something I had been doing gradually, deliberately seeding the impression that my health was declining in ways I had not yet disclosed. I went upstairs, changed into a plain shirt, and sat at the small desk in my private study, where George Tabor had routed the secondary camera feeds to a locked monitor, accessible only through a hardware key I kept on the same ring as the watch's transfer cable. George Tabor had been with Holt Dynamics for 6 years. He had started as a network infrastructure coordinator and risen to head of operations through a combination of technical precision and the rare quality of knowing when not to speak. I trusted George in the way you trust someone who has never once given you a reason not to. He had installed the extended camera coverage 3 days ago during a routine security upgrade, a completely legitimate procedure that required no explanation to anyone in the house, including Vivienne and Garrett, who had been informed only that the system was being refreshed. I pulled up the East Corridor feed first. Empty. Then the guest sitting room. Empty. Then I switched to the kitchen feed, the one covering the countertop and the refrigerator, and I went very still. Vivienne was standing at the kitchen island with her back to the camera. She was not making tea. She was not getting water. She was holding a small dark glass bottle, the kind used for essential oils or concentrated tinctures, and she was using a pipette to transfer drops of its contents into a larger container that I recognized immediately. It was the glass pitcher of filtered water I kept on the second shelf of the refrigerator. The pitcher I used every night before bed. My chest did not tighten. My hands did not shake. What I felt instead was something colder and more absolute than fear, the sensation of a suspicion becoming a certainty of a door, closing quietly behind you in a room you already knew was locked. I watched her work. She was methodical, unhurried, and wore a thin pair of latex gloves that she folded carefully into her cardigan pocket when she was finished. She returned the bottle to the inside of her cosmetic bag, which she had set on the counter, and then she rinsed the pipette under the tap, dried it, and placed it back in the bag as well. The entire sequence took 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She moved the way someone moves when they have done something enough times to stop being nervous about it. This was not the Earl Grey compound from 2 weeks ago. That had been detectable, traceable, and relatively low in concentration, consistent with the early-stage sedation approach Dr. Merritt's toxicology contact had identified. What Vivienne had just added to my water pitcher was something different. The dark glass bottle indicated a light-sensitive compound. The pipette indicated precision dosing. The latex gloves indicated she understood she was handling something she did not want on her skin. She had upgraded. I transferred the kitchen footage to an encrypted drive and sent a compressed file to both Bennett Cross and Ray Dunbar within the hour. Ray responded at 11:43 at night with 3 words, "securing the chain." In law enforcement terms, that meant he was establishing a documented evidentiary record timestamps file authentication and a secure custodial log so that the footage could not be challenged as tampered or fabricated when it was eventually submitted to a court. Bennett responded 12 minutes later with a single line, "Do not touch the pitcher." I had no intention of touching the pitcher. What I did instead was wait until 1 in the morning when the house was completely silent and walk downstairs in bare feet to the kitchen. I stood in front of the open refrigerator for a long moment, looking at the pitcher on the second shelf. The water inside looked exactly as it always did, clear, still, ordinary. I thought about the 8 years I had spent building Holt Dynamics and the 5 years before that, drifting through cities with nothing but a duffel bag and a patent sketch, and the stubborn refusal to believe that the people who had taken everything from me would be allowed to define what I became. I closed the refrigerator without touching anything. Back in my study, I sat in the dark and rewound the footage one more time, watching Vivienne's hands move with quiet precision over my water pitcher. I watched it until I had memorized every second of it. Then, I locked the drive, set the watch on the desk beside me, and thought about what I was going to say to Wren in the morning. Whatever Vivienne had put in that pitcher, she had just handed me exactly what I needed. She simply did not know it yet. I started forgetting things on a Tuesday. Not genuinely, not in any way that touched the actual mechanisms of my mind, but carefully, deliberately in the manner of a man who has decided that the most effective trap is one the other person builds themselves. I misplaced my reading glasses at breakfast and spent 4 minutes patting my pockets while Vivienne watched from across the table with an expression she was not quite fast enough to neutralize before I caught it. It was not concern. It was the particular stillness of someone watching a process they have set in motion begin to produce results. I noted it. I said nothing. I found my glasses in my breast pocket and laughed softly at myself. And the laugh was entirely convincing because I had been practicing it since 5 that morning. The performance had to be gradual. That was the critical element. A sudden and dramatic decline would invite suspicion. Doctors called in family members, alarmed questions asked that I could not afford to be asked. But a slow, uneven deterioration, the kind that might be attributed to stress or age, or the early effects of something a man had not yet admitted to his physician, that was a different matter entirely. That was the kind of decline people rationalize away, because it is more comfortable to rationalize than to confront. Vivienne was comfortable, That was her weakness. Over the following 4 days, I built the performance in careful layers. I repeated a question I had already asked at dinner, then looked briefly confused when Garrett pointed it out. I left my office door open when I took a phone call and allowed my voice to carry just enough uncertainty about a quarterly projection figure that George, passing in the hallway, gave me a sharp look. I answered with the smallest shake of my head. George understood. He had understood from the moment I briefed him 2 weeks prior, and he had not broken composure once. I was grateful for him, in a way that was difficult to articulate, the kind of gratitude that exists between people who have worked closely enough together that words become mostly redundant. On the 5th day, I stumbled on the bottom stair. I did not fall. I caught the banister and steadied myself, but the stumble was visible, and Garrett was standing in the front hallway when it happened. He went very still. Then he crossed the foyer in 4 steps, and took my arm with both hands, guiding me to the nearest chair, with a solicitousness that was so precisely calibrated, it almost impressed me. Almost. "Dad," he said, and the word landed awkwardly the way a word does when someone uses it as a tool rather than a name. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. I pressed one hand to my temple, let it linger there a moment too long. "Just moved too fast." He nodded slowly, his eyes moving over my face with an attention that had nothing to do with affection. He was reading me the way a person reads a contract, looking for the clause that benefits them. That evening I heard them through the watch. I had been sitting in the upstairs study with the door slightly ajar. The watch on the desk, the room dark except for the glow of the monitor. The voice activation threshold Harold had set was sensitive enough to capture conversation from the sitting room at the end of the corridor, provided both voices were at normal speaking volume. Vivian's was. Garrett's rose occasionally above it when he became agitated, which he did twice in the first 10 minutes. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. I will not recount every word of it here, because some of it was simply ugly in the way that purely mercenary conversations are ugly, stripped of everything human, reduced to numbers and timelines and contingencies. But the substance of it was clear. Vivian believed the compound was working. She used the phrase progressing ahead of schedule in reference to what she interpreted as my cognitive decline. Garrett asked about the will. Vivian told him Bennett Cross had confirmed the document was in order. She did not know, could not have known, that the version of the will Bennett had shown her was not the version that would matter. Garrett asked how much longer. Vivian said she was not certain, but that they needed to move before I had reason to call in an independent medical evaluation. She said the word evaluation with a precision that told me she had researched exactly what such a process would involve and exactly how it would complicate their timeline. My hand was resting on the desk beside the watch. I looked at it in the dim light from the monitor. It was steady, completely steady. I had spent 5 years being broken down to nothing and building myself back up from the floor of a Denver motel room, and whatever Vivian believed she was dismantling with her dark glass bottle and her latex gloves and her careful conversations behind closed doors, it was not what she thought it was. She was not dismantling a man. She was dismantling a version of a man I had allowed her to see. The real one was sitting in the dark listening to every word. I transferred the audio file to the encrypted drive and sent it to Ray Dunbar at 11 that night. His response came back in under 10 minutes, which told me he had been awake and waiting. It said, confirmed, conspiracy language present, moving to next phase. I put the watch back on my wrist, turned off the monitor, and sat for a long time in the silence of the house thinking about the word phase and what it meant for everyone sleeping under my roof. Whatever came next, they had chosen it themselves. Before I go any further, if you are still with me, drop the number 57 in the comments. That is all. Just let me know you are here, because what comes next is the part that changes everything. A gentle reminder, some elements of this story are fictional, built for storytelling and reflection. If that is not something you want to continue with, this is a perfectly fine place to stop. No judgment at all. I had not been to Pike Place Market in nearly 3 months. There is something about that part of Seattle that I have always found clarifying the noise of it. The salt smell off the water, the vendors calling out to no one in particular, the sense that the city is conducting its ordinary business completely indifferent to whatever private crisis you have carried down from the hill. I needed that indifference on the morning I walked down to meet Marcus Elroy at the corner table of a coffee shop tucked behind the fish stalls on the lower level. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and windows, so fogged with steam that no one outside could see in. Marcus was already there when I arrived. He was 61 years old, heavy-set in the shoulders, with the kind of face that looked permanently skeptical, even when he was in a good mood, which when I sat down across from him, and he pushed a black coffee toward me, without being asked, he appeared to be. Marcus Elroy had made his first fortune in venture capital during the late 90s and lost most of it twice before rebuilding through energy sector investments. He had found me in 2021 through a mutual contact at a Seattle engineering conference, read my patent application in a single sitting, and called me the next morning with a funding offer that I had accepted. Not because I needed the money I had enough by then, but because Marcus understood the technology in a way that most investors did not. And that kind of understanding is worth more than capital. He was also the only person outside of Ren Bennett and Ray who knew what was happening inside the Medina house. "You look tired," he said. "I'm performing tired," I said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. Almost. Marcus Elroy did not smile easily, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. Easy smiles in business are almost always borrowed against something. I had called him 4 days ago with 2 words, "She's here," and he had understood immediately. We had spoken briefly once since then, but this was the first time we had met in person since Vivienne and Garrett arrived, and there were things I needed to say to Marcus directly, not over a phone line and not inside a house with people in it who were listening for the sound of anything that might complicate their plans. I told him about the picture. I told him about the watch recording. I told him about Ray Dunbar's confirmation of conspiracy language and the evidentiary chain now being assembled. Marcus listened, the way he always listened, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, his large hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past my left shoulder, which was his way of concentrating deeply on something he was hearing rather than watching. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "And Bennett's clause," he said, "the one in the estate document." "She hasn't found it," I said. "She thinks the version she reviewed is the operative one." "And the divorce filing. Finalized March 2020, I said. "She doesn't know Bennett has the certified copy. She believes the dissolution was never completed because the original attorney withdrew before filing. What she doesn't know is that I retained Bennett 18 months ago, specifically to locate the filed record and have it authenticated." Marcus set his cup down. "So she's not legally your wife?" "She hasn't been for 4 years, I said. He absorbed that. Outside the fogged window, the market was building toward its midday noise cart wheels, on cobblestone voices layering over each other, the sharp smell of fresh fish drifting through the gap under the door. I had always thought Pike Place smelled like honesty. Everything sold here was exactly what it appeared to be. "There's something else," Marcus said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, which he slid across the table toward me. "My attorney flagged this 2 days ago." I unfolded it. It was a printout of a wire transfer record not from any account I recognized, but from an account registered to a shell company called Ashworth Meridian LLC, incorporated in Delaware 8 months ago. The transfer destination was a private account in the Cayman Islands. The amount was $430,000. The transfer date was 3 weeks before Vivienne had appeared in the lobby of Holt Dynamics. I looked up at Marcus. "Damon Ford," he said quietly. My attorney ran a background search when I told him Vivienne had made contact. Damon has been moving money out of accounts tied to Vivienne's existing assets for the past 14 months. She either knows and is complicit, or she doesn't know, and she's being robbed by the man she left me for." He paused. "Either way, it changes her financial picture considerably." My chest tightened not with anger, but with something close to a grim, exhausted recognition. Even the people who were supposed to be on Vivienne's side were not entirely on her side. That was what happened when you built a life on extraction rather than trust. Eventually, everyone around you learned the same language. I refolded the paper and slid it back to Marcus. "Send the full record to Bennett," I said. "Ray needs to see it too." Marcus nodded and pocketed the paper. We sat for another few minutes, finishing our coffee in the companionable silence of 2 men who had both lost things they should not have lost, and rebuilt things they were not certain they deserved, and who had arrived through different routes at the same understanding of what patience actually costs. When I stood to leave, Marcus looked up at me. "How much longer?" He asked the same question Garrett had asked Vivienne through the wall of the sitting room 6 nights ago. I pulled on my jacket and picked up the watch from the table where I had set it. "Not long," I said. The house had its own rhythms, and after 3 weeks inside it, with Vivienne and Garrett, I had learned every one of them. Garrett rose late, usually around 9, and spent the first hour of his morning on his phone in the kitchen, with a bowl of cereal he rarely finished. Vivienne was an earlier riser, 6:30 most mornings, sometimes 6, and she moved through the house with a deliberate quietness that I had once interpreted as consideration and now understood as surveillance. She was always checking. The position of things on counters, the documents on my desk if the door was left open, the expression on my face when I came downstairs. She was cataloging everything, building a picture of a man in decline, and she was good at it. I gave her just enough to keep the picture coherent. What I had not anticipated was Wren. Not Wren herself. I had anticipated everything about Wren. Her steadiness, her instincts, her ability to move through a room without drawing attention. What I had not anticipated was the specific thing she found on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of June while I was at the Holt Dynamics office for a board meeting and Vivienne had gone to a salon appointment in Bellevue. Wren called me at 2:17 in the afternoon. Her voice was level, which was how I knew immediately that something was wrong, because Wren's voice only became that level when she was managing something that would otherwise make it shake. "I need you to come home," she said. "Not urgently, but today." I wrapped up the meeting 40 minutes early, gave George a look that required no explanation, and drove back to Medina through the early afternoon traffic, with the kind of controlled focus that pushes everything irrelevant to the edges of your mind until only the road and the destination remain. Wren was waiting in the upstairs study. She had closed the door and drawn the interior curtain across the small window that looked out onto the landing. On the desk in front of her was a small object in a clear Ziploc evidence bag, the kind sold in any hardware store, not a law enforcement bag, but sufficient for preserving surface integrity until Ray could collect it properly. Inside the bag was a dark glass bottle, not the same one I had seen on the kitchen camera 3 weeks ago. That bottle had been smaller, more slender, with a plain black dropper cap. This one was wider, with a ground glass stopper and a paper label that had been peeled away, leaving only a faint, rectangular ghost of adhesive on the surface. It was approximately 2/3 full of a pale straw-colored liquid. I sat down slowly. Where I said, "Her cosmetic case," Wren said. "The large one she keeps on the bathroom shelf. I wasn't searching it, I was replacing the hand towels and it had been left unzipped." She paused. The bottle was wrapped in a black cloth pouch at the bottom, underneath everything else. I recognized the glass type from the toxicology notes Dr. Merritt sent. Dr. Sandra Merritt had included a reference document with her preliminary analysis 3 weeks ago, a pharmaceutical reference guide to controlled substance delivery formats used in gradual dosing cases. Ground glass stoppered bottles of that specific amber to pale profile were associated with concentrated alkaloid compounds, the kind that accumulated in tissue over repeated low-level exposure rather than producing an immediate acute reaction. They were difficult to detect in standard metabolic panels and required a targeted toxicology screen to identify. That was almost certainly why Vivienne had upgraded from the dropper bottle. The first compound had been a sedative-adjacent formulation. This one was something with a longer reach. I did not touch the bag. I looked at it for a long moment, and what I felt was not fear and not anger, but something that lived beneath both of those, a profound and bone-deep weariness at the fact that this was real, that the woman who had once sat across from me at a kitchen table in Boston and talked about growing old together had arrived at this particular point in her life and made these particular choices, and was at this moment in a salon in Bellevue having her hair done, while a bottle of poison sat in a bag on my desk. "You did the right thing," I said to Wren. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright in the way they get when she is holding something back by force of will. "I keep thinking about how long it's been here," she said, "whether it was here from the beginning or whether she brought it later." "It doesn't matter," I said, though we both knew it did matter in the way that all the details of something like this matter, even when they are not operationally relevant. "What matters is that Ray has it tonight." I called Ray Dunbar at 2:51 in the afternoon. He arrived at the house at 4:15, entering through the rear service gate with a single evidence kit and no marked vehicle. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried movements of someone who had processed enough crime scenes to understand that speed and efficiency are not the same thing. He bagged the bottle using proper chain of custody protocol, photographed in situ, logged with a case number, sealed with tamper-evident tape, and was out of the house in under 30 minutes. Before leaving, Ray photographed the bottle's position inside the cosmetic case with a calibrated reference marker, then returned it to its exact location. This was standard pre-warrant controlled evidence procedure. Removing the bottle before the arrest would alert Vivienne that the house had been searched, collapsing the timeline before the warrant could be executed. The authenticated photographs served as the legal record. The The bottle itself remained in place until the arrest made its removal unnecessary. Before he left, he paused at the back door and looked at me with the particular expression of a man who is about to say something factual that carries a great deal of weight. "The second compound confirms premeditation," he said. "Two distinct substances, two separate delivery methods introduced over a sustained period. That's not impulse. That's planning." He let that settle for a moment. "We're ready when you are." I nodded. He left. Ren and I stood in the kitchen together as Vivian's car turned into the driveway, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window before the garage door swallowed it whole. I heard the engine cut. I heard the car door close. I heard the interior door from the garage open, and Vivian's footsteps crossed the laundry room floor, unhurried and ordinary, the footsteps of a woman who believed everything was proceeding exactly as she had planned. I turned to Ren and she looked back at me, and neither of us said anything at all because there was nothing left to say that the moment had not already said for us. Before I reveal what that watch recorded, and I promise you nothing about this will be what you expect, drop "play it" in the comments right now. Let me know you are still here, because 47 minutes of audio is about to change every single thing. One thing worth knowing: this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and meaningful reflection. If you would prefer not to continue, this is your moment to choose. What follows is not easy to unhear. The watch recorded 47 minutes of audio on the night of July 3rd. I had not planned for it to happen that particular night. I had been wearing the watch continuously for weeks, voice activation running at all times, and most of what it captured was ordinary. The sound of rooms being moved through doors opening and closing the television, Garrett kept on too loud in the guest sitting room until past midnight. The watch had collected fragments, partial sentences, tonal impressions. Nothing that constituted the clear and sustained conspiratorial conversation Ray needed to anchor the case at its center. Until July 3rd. I had gone to bed early, or appeared to. I lay fully dressed on top of the covers in the dark with the watch on my wrist and the room silent, and I waited in the manner of someone who has learned that patience is not the absence of urgency, but the discipline of not acting on it prematurely. At 10:48 at night, the watch's activation threshold triggered. I could feel the faint vibration against my wrist. Harold had added that feature without being asked a single pulse to indicate recording had begun, so I would always know. What followed was 47 minutes that changed everything. Vivian spoke first. Her voice was low, but not a whisper. The voice of someone who believed the house was asleep and had stopped being careful about volume. She told Garrett that Dr. Merritt had called the office that afternoon, asking to schedule a comprehensive neurological evaluation. I had arranged that call deliberately through George 3 days prior, a move designed to create exactly the pressure I was now hearing Vivian respond to. The evaluation, she said, could not be allowed to happen. If an independent neurologist examined me and found no organic basis for my apparent decline, the entire premise of their timeline collapsed. Garrett asked what she intended to do. What she said next, I have turned over in my mind many times since, and each time it lands with the same cold weight. She said they needed to accelerate. She used the word accelerate the way a person uses a word they have chosen, with great deliberateness, because it allows them to describe something irreversible without having to say it plainly. She said the current compound required 6 to 8 weeks for full accumulative effect, but that a dosage increase administered consistently over the next 10 to 12 days would compress that window significantly. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "How much do we increase it?" And Vivian told him. I lay in the dark and listened to my wife, the woman who was not legally. My wife who had not been my wife for 4 years, who was sleeping 40 feet down the corridor in a room I had furnished and a bed I had bought. Describe in clear and specific terms the precise quantity of a toxic compound she intended to introduce into my system over the following 10 days in order to produce a result that could be attributed to natural neurological decline. My hand was on my chest. I could feel my own heartbeat under my palm, steady and unchanged, and I focused on that steadiness the way you focus on a fixed point when the ground beneath you becomes unreliable. I was not going to fall apart in a dark room at 11 o'clock at night because 2 people down the hallway had confirmed in explicit detail what I had already known for weeks. I was going to lie still and breathe and let the watch do what Harold had built it to do. The conversation continued for another 23 minutes after that. Garrett raised the question of Ren, whether she might notice changes, whether she could be removed from the house on some pretext. Vivian dismissed the concern with a brevity that told me she had already assessed Wren and arrived at the same conclusion I had feared she would, that Wren as an adopted child with no biological claim and no legal standing in the estate was a manageable variable. The word she used was irrelevant. That word cost Vivian more than she knew. At 11:37, the conversation ended. I heard footsteps a door, and then silence. The watch pulsed once against my wrist. Recording concluded. I lay still for another 10 minutes staring at the ceiling, feeling the specific quality of rage that does not express itself as heat or noise, but as a kind of absolute crystalline clarity about what must be done and in what order. Then I sat up, transferred the audio file to the encrypted drive, and composed a message to Ray Dunbar and Bennett Cross simultaneously. I did not summarize the recording. I sent the full file and wrote 4 words beneath it, "This is the one." Ray's response came at 12:51 in the morning. It was longer than his usual replies, 3 full sentences, which for Ray constituted something close to a speech. He wrote, "Audio is clean and admissible under RCW 9.73.030, Washington's one-party consent statute. Conspiracy to commit first-degree assault confirmed. I am filing for the warrant tomorrow morning." I read that message 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand, lay back against the pillow, and closed my eyes. Down the corridor, the house was completely silent. 47 minutes of audio. 4 years of waiting. 1 warrant filed in the morning. They had chosen their night. So had I. The warrant came through on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Ray called me at 3:46, not from his personal cell, but from a number I did not recognize. A precaution he explained later that he used when a call contained information he preferred not to have associated with a traceable line during an active investigation. His voice was the same as it always was, flat-measured, carrying information, the way a pipe carries water without editorial comment or unnecessary pressure. "King County Superior Court signed the arrest warrant this morning," he said. "Judge Harlan Morrow, Department 14. Charges filed are conspiracy to commit first-degree assault and unlawful delivery of a controlled substance under RCW 69.50.401. The warrant is sealed pending execution." I was standing at the window of my office on the 40th floor of Holt Dynamics looking out over Elliott Bay. A ferry was crossing the water, white and unhurried, moving through the gray chop of the Sound, the way large, slow things move when they have no reason to rush. I watched it for a moment before I spoke. "Timeline," I said. "We execute within 48 to 72 hours, Ray said. "I need you to do nothing different. Same routine, same performance. If they sense anything has shifted, they may attempt to leave the premises or destroy evidence." "Understood," I said. "One more thing," Ray said, and there was a fractional pause before he continued, that told me what followed was not procedural. "The toxicology report on the second bottle came back this morning from the UW lab. The compound is a synthetic alkaloid derivative not commercially available, not something you find in a pharmacy or order online. It requires synthesis. Whoever sourced it had access to either a private laboratory or a well-connected supplier." Another pause. "It's the kind of thing that adds a charge, possibly federal, depending on the supply chain." I said nothing for a moment. Through the window, the ferry had reached the midpoint of its crossing, small against the scale of the water. "And how does that affect the warrant?" I asked. "It doesn't delay it," Ray said. "It expands it. I've flagged the synthesis question to the DEA field office in Seattle. They are monitoring, not intervening, not yet. Our warrant proceeds on schedule." We ended the call. I stood at the window for another few minutes, thinking about a synthetic alkaloid that required a private laboratory to produce, and about the wire transfer Marcus had shown me at Pike Place, and about Damon Ford, whose name kept appearing at the edges of this situation in ways that suggested he was less peripheral than he appeared. I met with Bennett Cross the following morning, at his office in the Columbia Center, building 42nd floor. A spare and precisely ordered space that reflected its occupant, exactly nothing unnecessary. Nothing misplaced, everything positioned for maximum functional clarity. Bennett was 53 lean, with silver-rimmed glasses and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where the wrong gesture can alter an outcome. He had been my attorney for 4 years, and in that time, I had never once seen him rattled. He was not rattled now. But he was serious in a way that had deepened since our last meeting. He laid 3 documents on the desk between us. The first was the authenticated copy of the divorce decree finalized March 14th, 2020, in King County Superior Court. The document that established Vivienne had no legal standing as my spouse and therefore no claim under spousal inheritance law. The second was the revised estate document containing the hidden clause, a clause that directed the entirety of my estate, in the event of my death under any circumstances classified as non-natural or under active criminal investigation, to a blind trust administered by Marcus Elroy and Bennett jointly with Wren Holt as sole beneficiary. The third document was a cease and desist letter addressed to Ashworth Meridian, LLC, the Delaware shell company Damon Ford had used to move $430,000 out of accounts tied to Vivienne's existing assets. The cease and desist is informational at this stage, Bennett said. It establishes that we are aware of the shell company and its activity. It also, if Damon receives it before the arrest, may cause him to make a move that Ray can use. You want him to run? I said. Bennett adjusted his glasses with one finger. I want him to react. Running is one form of reaction. There are others. He folded his hands on the desk. What I want you to understand, Desmond, is that within 48 hours, this situation will move from your control into the hands of the court system. Once Ray executes that warrant, the sequence is fixed. There will be things that happen that you cannot direct and cannot stop. You need to be prepared for that. I looked at the three documents on the desk: the divorce decree, the hidden clause, the cease and desist. Years of careful preparation reduced to paper and ink, and the weight of what they represented. I've been prepared for this for 5 years, I said. Bennett looked at me over his glasses for a long moment. Then he gathered the documents into a neat stack and slid them into a manila folder. Then we're ready, he said. I left the Columbia Center and walked out onto Fifth Avenue into the late afternoon heat, the city moving around me in its ordinary way, indifferent and continuous. I had 48 hours. Vivienne and Garrett were at the Medina house living inside a story they believed they were writing. Wren was there too quiet and watchful, and the watch was on my wrist, and Ray Dunbar had a sealed warrant in a courthouse on 3rd Avenue, and somewhere across the city. Damon Ford was about to receive a letter that would tell him without saying it directly that someone had been paying very close attention. 48 hours. I had waited 5 years. 48 hours was nothing at all. The last full day before everything changed was a Saturday, and it was unremarkable in almost every way. The morning came in bright and clear, which was unusual for Seattle. In late summer, the kind of morning that feels borrowed from somewhere warmer. The sky a pale and cloudless blue over the surface of Lake Washington. The light coming through the east windows of the Medina house at an angle that made everything look briefly generous. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee I did not taste and watched a pair of herons move along the shoreline below the property, slow and deliberate, hunting in the shallows with a particular patience of creatures that have learned to wait without suffering for it. I envied them briefly. Vivienne came downstairs at 6:40 earlier than usual. She was dressed already not casually, the way a person dresses on a Saturday morning in a house where they are a guest, but with the kind of composed precision that told me she was managing something internal. Her expression when she saw me at the window was pleasant and controlled and entirely opaque, and she said, "Good morning," in the voice she used when she was performing normalcy, which was a slightly warmer register than her actual voice, and always had been even in the years before everything broke apart. I said good morning back. I offered her coffee. She accepted. We stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island in the bright Saturday light and performed the small courtesies of two people sharing a space, and the distance between what was being said and what was being thought was so vast that I felt it physically a pressure behind the sternum, not quite pain, not quite anything, with a name. Garrett came down an hour later. He was wearing a collared shirt, which was notable because Garrett had not worn a collared shirt on any other morning since his arrival. He ate breakfast with more deliberateness than usual, slower the way a person eats when they are building towards something and using the meal as a frame for their composure. He glanced at me 3 times during the meal, and each time found me looking at my coffee or the window, apparently elsewhere, apparently diminished in the small ways I had been carefully constructing for weeks. After breakfast, I told them both I was going to spend the morning in the study and would likely nap in the afternoon. Vivienne nodded with the soft, concerned expression she had been cultivating since the 2nd week. Garrett said nothing, but I saw his hand tighten briefly around his juice glass before he set it down. I went upstairs. I did not nap. I sat at the desk in the study and spent 4 hours reviewing every document in the case file Bennett had compiled, not because I needed to, not because there was anything in it I had not already read 3 times, but because I needed to do something with my hands and my mind that was not waiting. The divorce decree, the estate clause, the toxicology reports, the wire transfer record, the watch audio files time-stamped and authenticated sitting on the encrypted drive in their neat digital rows. Ray's warrant confirmation. The DEA monitoring notification. 47 minutes of a conversation that two people had conducted, believing they were alone and unheard in a house that had been listening to them from the beginning. At 2 in the afternoon, Wren knocked on the study door and came in without waiting for an answer, which was her way of telling me she needed to say something she had been holding for a while. She sat in the chair across from the desk and looked at me with the direct, undeflected gaze she had developed somewhere in her early 20s and never lost. "Damon called her this morning," she said. "I heard Vivian in her room. She wasn't loud, but the door wasn't fully closed." She paused. "She told him to be patient. She said it would be over soon." I set the document I was holding flat on the desk. "Did she say where he is?" I asked. "Portland," Wren said. "She said, when I get back to Portland." She caught herself and lowered her voice after that. I noted it and sent a one-line message to Ray. He responded in 6 minutes. "Portland field contact already on Ford. Confirmed." The afternoon moved slowly in the way that afternoons move when you are inside a countdown and cannot accelerate it. I came downstairs at 4 and sat in the living room and read a book I did not absorb, turning pages at intervals that approximated the pace of actual reading. Vivian sat across the room with a magazine. Garrett was on his phone. The late afternoon light shifted across the floor between us, golden and indifferent. And the house was so quiet, I could hear the clock on the mantel marking each second with a small, precise sound. At 6, Vivian offered to make dinner. I said that would be kind. She went to the kitchen, and I listened to the sounds of her moving through it. Cabinets opening water, running the low register of her voice when she called something to Garrett, and I thought about the fact that this was the last evening of a particular kind of performance for all of us, and that after tomorrow, the stage would be struck and there would be nothing left but what was true. After dinner, I excused myself early as I always did. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister, and I did not look back. At the top of the stairs, I stopped for just a moment and stood in the dark of the upper landing, the house spread out below me. The lights of the lower rooms warmed through the doorways, the sound of the television starting up in the guest sitting room. I stood there, and I breathed, and I pressed my fingers once against the face of the watch on my wrist, and I thought about herons in still water, hunting with the patience of things that do not doubt themselves. Tomorrow was Sunday. By Sunday evening it would be done. Sunday morning arrived the way significant mornings sometimes do, quietly without announcement, indistinguishable from any other morning until you were already inside it. I came downstairs at 7 and found the kitchen empty. The coffee maker had already run its cycle. Vivian had been down earlier, then returned upstairs, which was unusual. I noted it the way I had learned to note everything in that house over the past 2 months, not with alarm, but with the careful attention of someone cataloging details for a record that would eventually matter. I poured a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and waited. Wren came down at 7:40. She was dressed, her hair pulled back, and she moved into the kitchen with the practiced ease of someone who had spent weeks calibrating how ordinary she appeared. She poured herself a glass of water, stood at the counter with her back to the doorway, and spoke to me in a low-level voice without turning around. "It happened last night," she said. "I need to tell you what I did." I set my cup down. She told me everything in the order it had occurred, slowly and without interruption, the way a person recounts something they have replayed in their own mind, enough times that the sequence has become fixed and precise. This is what she said. At 11:45, the previous night, she had been in the upstairs hallway when she heard Garrett come out of his room and go downstairs. She had not been sleeping. Neither of us had been sleeping, though we had not spoken about it. She had followed him to the landing and listened. Garrett went to the kitchen. She heard the refrigerator open. She heard the particular sound of the glass pitcher being moved on the shelf, a sound she had memorized because she had been listening for it for days. She went downstairs. She did not go fast. She told me because going fast would have made noise. She went the way she had taught herself to move through the house at night over the past 2 months, close to the wall. Weight distributed forward, avoiding the third step from the bottom, which had a creak she had mapped on her second day in the house. She reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. Garrett was standing at the counter with his back to her. He had poured a glass of milk from the carton in the refrigerator, not from the pitcher, she noted, which told her he was not yet aware that the pitcher had been the primary vehicle. He had set the glass on the counter and was holding the second bottle, the one Ray had photographed and logged and returned to its exact position in Vivian's cosmetic case as part of the evidence protocol. and he was measuring drops into the milk glass with the careful, unhurried precision of someone following instructions. Wren's hands were shaking as she told me this part. Not violently, just at the edges, just enough that she pressed them flat against the counter behind her as she spoke, steadying herself against the surface the way you steady yourself against something solid when the thing you were describing is not solid at all. She waited until Garrett left the kitchen. He took the milk glass with him, not to his own room, she said, but toward the east corridor toward my bedroom. She gave him 40 seconds. Then she went to the kitchen, took a clean glass from the cabinet, filled it from the tap, and carried it down the corridor. She had to move quickly. Then she told me, because there was only one place Garrett would leave the glass, and that was on the small table outside my bedroom door. A habit she had observed him establishing over the past week, small offerings of water or juice left where I would find them in the morning, gestures of concern that had never been gestures of concern at all. She reached the corridor just as Garrett's door was closing. The glass was on the table. She switched them. She took the poisoned glass and replaced it with the clean one, and then she walked back to the kitchen and stood over the sink and poured the contents of the poisoned glass down the drain, her hands trembling so badly by that point that she gripped the edge of the sink with both hands to keep from dropping it. She stood there for a long time, she said, listening to the house, making sure no door opened, making sure no footstep came. The house stayed silent. When she finished telling me, she finally turned around from the counter. Her eyes were bright and wet at the corners, and her jaw was set in the way it gets when she is refusing to let something surface that is pressing very hard to do so. "I should have told you last night," she said. "I didn't, because I needed to be certain I remembered it exactly. I didn't want to tell you and then not be certain." I stood up from the table. I crossed the kitchen and put both arms around her and held on, and she pressed her face against my shoulder, and her whole body shook once a single involuntary release of everything she had been holding since 11:45 the previous night, and then she steadied the way she always steadied from the inside out. "You were certain enough," I said. She pulled back and looked at me. Her eyes were clear now, the brightness still there, but no longer precarious. "What happens today?" she asked. I looked at the watch on my wrist. It was 8:14 in the morning. Ray Dunbar was already on his way. "Today," I said, "everyone finds out what they built." Ray Dunbar arrived at the Medina house at 9:47 in the morning. He came in 2 vehicles, an unmarked black sedan and a King County Sheriff's Office patrol unit that parked at the service gate rather than the front drive, a deliberate choice that Ray had explained to me the night before. A marked vehicle at the front entrance would be visible from the guest corridor windows. He needed Vivian and Garrett inside the house, and unaware until the moment the door opened, and he needed that. For evidentiary reasons, any attempt to flee or destroy evidence prior to arrest would constitute an additional charge and would also, practically speaking, complicate the next 40 minutes considerably. George Tabor let them in through the rear service entrance. George had been at the house since 7 that morning, ostensibly to assist with a network maintenance issue he had fabricated as a pretext 3 days earlier. His actual role that morning was to ensure every interior camera was recording to the authenticated server, and to confirm that no one had tampered with the East Corridor feeds overnight. He met me in the kitchen when I came downstairs and said 2 words, all running. That was sufficient. Wren was in the study upstairs. I had asked her to stay there until I came for her, and she had agreed without argument, which told me she understood that what was about to happen needed to unfold in a particular sequence, and that her presence in the rooms below would introduce variables that none of us could fully control. She was steady when I left her. Her hands were still. Ray came through the rear door at 9:47, and I met him in the laundry room. He was in plain clothes, dark jacket, no badge visible, the kind of appearance that reads as civilian until it doesn't. 2 sheriff's deputies came in behind him, also plain-clothed, and positioned themselves at the corridor junctions, the way people position themselves when they have done this enough times to move through an unfamiliar floor plan without needing to discuss it. "They both in their rooms?" Ray asked. "Vivian was upstairs when I came down at 7, I said. "I haven't seen Garrett this morning." Ray nodded and looked at the deputy to his left, who had already moved to the base of the stairs. Then he looked back at me with the expression of a man who is about to do the thing he has been building toward and has no uncertainty about it. "Stay in the kitchen," he said. I stayed in the kitchen. What happened in the next 11 minutes I know partly from what I heard, and partly from what Ray told me afterward, and partly from the camera footage that George authenticated and submitted to the court 3 days later. I will recount it as it reached me through walls, through the house's acoustics, through the particular quality of sound that a building produces when something irrevocable is happening inside it. I heard Ray's voice on the stairs, clear and procedural, identifying himself and the warrant. I heard a door open Vivian's room by the location of it. I heard her voice sharp and high, in a register I had not heard from her, before a register that had nothing composed or calibrated about it. The sound of a performance ending abruptly because the audience had turned out to be something other than what she expected. Then I heard Garrett. He had not been in his room. He had been in the kitchen hallway. I realized this a half second before I heard the sound, which was the sound of a man hitting the floor. Not a fall from height, not a collapse, the specific sound of a body losing its structural coordination. Suddenly and completely, a heavy sideways uncontrolled descent to the hardwood that rattled the cabinet above the baseboard. I was through the doorway in less than 3 seconds. Garrett was on the floor of the hallway outside the kitchen, on his side, one arm thrown out at an angle that was wrong. His face was gray-white and sheened with sweat. His lips pressed together against something that wanted to come out of them, loudly. His eyes wide and fixed on a point on the ceiling, with the unfocused intensity of someone whose body is conducting an emergency that their mind has not yet processed. His left hand was open on the floor beside him, and 6 inches from his fingers was the glass he had been carrying, the clean glass Wren had placed outside my bedroom door. He had retrieved it that morning, as she had observed him do with previous glasses all week, checking whether I had consumed what he left, then carrying the glass back to dispose of the evidence before the household woke. This morning, he had not made it far enough to dispose of anything. He had drunk it, not the poison, the water. But the sleep compound Wren had added to the clean glass, a fast-acting over-the-counter aid, the kind sold in any pharmacy, well within safe parameters, for a healthy adult just enough to produce a rapid onset of disorientation and physical destabilization in someone not expecting it, had done precisely what it was designed to do. I crouched beside him. His eyes moved to my face, and something passed through them that I had not expected. Not rage, not accusation, but something closer to a kind of terrible arriving comprehension. The look of a person understanding in real time the full shape of something they had only seen pieces of until this moment. "Dad," he said. The word came out broken and airless, barely enough to be a word at all. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the boy he had been before the man he had become, and I thought about what it costs a person to choose what Garrett had chosen, and I felt something that I did not expect to feel and could not entirely name. Not forgiveness, not yet, and not cruelty either, but something that lived in the complicated territory between them, in the space where grief and clarity sometimes occupy the same moment. "I know," I said. Then Ray was in the hallway, and the deputies were there, and the house filled suddenly with voices and movement, and the hard procedural sounds of an arrest being executed, and I stood up and stepped back and let it happen. By 10:30 that Sunday morning, the Medina house was no longer mine in any way that felt ordinary. It was still mine, legally, still mine on every document that mattered, still the place where my coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, and my books lined the study shelves, and the old pocket watch had rested on the desk for 2 months, doing the quiet, essential work I had asked of it. But the rooms had taken on the particular quality that spaces acquire after something irrevocable happens inside them, a kind of altered air, a stillness that is not peaceful, but charged the way a room feels after a storm has moved through it, and everything that was standing is still standing, but nothing is quite where it was. Vivian had been placed in the rear seat of the unmarked sedan. I had not watched her walk to it. I had heard the front door open and close, heard the gravel of the driveway, heard the car door, and then silence. What I felt in that silence was not triumph and not grief in any simple form. It was something older and more complicated, the feeling of a wound finally being addressed after so many years of being managed that you had almost forgotten what it would feel like to stop managing it. Garrett had been transported to Harborview Medical Center, first as a precaution. The sedative Wren had introduced to the glass was a low-dose compound well within safe parameters, and Dr. Merritt had already been notified and was on her way to the hospital to confirm the compound's composition and provide clinical context to the attending physician, ensuring the attending had full information before treating Garrett. Ray had coordinated this in advance, which was the kind of detail that separated a careful investigation from a reckless one. Garrett would be medically cleared within a few hours, at which point he would be transferred to King County Correctional and processed on the same charges as his mother. I went upstairs and knocked on the study door. Wren opened it immediately, which told me she had been standing on the other side of it, Her face was pale, and her eyes moved over me quickly, reading me the way she always did, checking not for information, but for condition, the way you check someone you love after something difficult to make sure the thing that matters most is still intact. "It's done," I said. She closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4. And in those seconds, her face did something I had seen only a handful of times in 15 years. Something that was not quite crying and not quite relief, but existed in the narrow space between them, where very deep feelings sometimes go when they have nowhere else. Then she opened her eyes, and they were clear. And she nodded once firmly, as if confirming something she had decided a long time ago. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Bennett Cross arrived at 11:15. I had called him at 10:02, 90 seconds after the sedan left the driveway, and he had said simply, "I'll be there by 11." He arrived in a gray suit on a Sunday morning, because Bennett Cross was the kind of attorney who treated the gravity of a situation as a reason to dress appropriately for it, which was one of the things I respected most about him. He came through the front door with a leather document case under one arm and shook my hand once firmly in the foyer and said nothing beyond that because there was nothing that needed to be said in the foyer. We sat in the living room, Bennett, Wren, and I, with the lake visible through the large south-facing windows, the water bright and flat in the Sunday morning light, the herons gone now from the shallows, the shoreline empty and still. Bennett set the document case on the coffee table and opened it. He removed 3 items and placed them side by side on the table with the deliberate spacing of a man who understands that physical presentation carries meaning. The first was the authenticated copy of the divorce decree, King County Superior Court, filed and finalized March 14th, 2020, 4 years and 4 months ago. The document established in the dry and absolute language of legal finality that Vivian Ashworth, the name she had used before the marriage and to which she legally reverted upon dissolution, had not been my wife since that date. Every claim she had made to the contrary, every form she had signed, using the name Vivian Holt, every legal instrument she had attempted to invoke on the basis of marital status was built on a foundation that did not exist. Bennett tapped the document once. "This will be submitted to the court as Exhibit A in the criminal proceeding," he said. "It also forms the basis for the fraud charge that the prosecutor's office will be adding to the indictment. She represented herself as your legal spouse to multiple parties, including the estate attorney she consulted independently over a sustained period. That is criminal fraud under RCW 9A.6 0.020. The second document was the estate instrument, the revised version containing the hidden clause that Vivian had never seen, that she had never been shown, because the version Bennett had allowed her to review had been a prior draft retained specifically for that purpose. Bennett turned to the relevant page and read the clause aloud in his level, measured voice, and I watched Wren's face as he read it. The clause stated that in the event of Desmond Holt's death, under any circumstances classified as non-natural or under active criminal investigation, or resulting from any act of deliberate harm, the entirety of the estate Holt dynamics included, would pass immediately to a blind trust, jointly administered by Marcus Elroy and Bennett Cross, with Wren Holt designated as sole beneficiary and successor trustee upon reaching the age of 30. It further stated that no claim by any former spouse, biological child, or party asserting familial relationship could supersede or modify the terms of the trust without a court order requiring a standard of proof equivalent to that required for a criminal conviction. Wren was very still as Bennett read. When he finished, she looked at me. "You wrote this before any of this started," she said. It was not a question. 18 months ago, I said. Before George extended the cameras, before the watch, before any of it. Because I knew even then that the people who had taken everything from me once would eventually want to try again, and I was not going to let them take you in the process. Her eyes filled then fully this time, without the managed restraint of earlier in the morning, and she pressed one hand over her mouth and looked away toward the window, her shoulders shaking with the effort of containing something that was very large and had been waiting a very long time to be felt. I reached across and put my hand on her arm and left it there. Bennett waited with the patience of a man who understood that legal instruments sometimes produce human responses that require a moment before the room can continue. When Wren turned back, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at Bennett with an expression that had moved through grief and arrived somewhere much steadier. "Oh, the third document," she said. Bennett allowed himself the smallest fraction of a smile. He picked up the third item from the table, not a document this time, but a printed record 2 pages stapled at the corner. He set it in front of us. It was the wire transfer summary Marcus's attorney had compiled, the full chain of Damon Ford's movements through Ashworth Meridian LLC, the Delaware Shell Company, to the Cayman Islands account. $430,000 extracted over 14 months. But the printed record in front of us now was not the same 2-page summary Marcus had shown me at Pike Place. It was 12 pages, and the total figure at the bottom of the final page was not $430,000. It was $1.2 million. I looked at Bennett. Marcus's attorney expanded the search after your Pike Place meeting, Bennett said. Damon had 3 shell companies, not one. Ashworth Meridian was the one he was careless about. The other 2 were cleaner, but not clean enough. He removed his glasses and set them on the table. Damon Ford has been systematically liquidating every asset Vivienne held outside of the Holt estate claim for the past 14 months. He intended to be gone before the arrest, before she was arrested, before she could look at her own accounts and realize what he had done. Did he make it? I asked. No, Bennett said. Portland DEA field contact detained him at PDX at 6:48 this morning. He had a one-way ticket to Cancun and a carry-on bag containing $62,000 in cash and 3 prepaid international phone cards. Bennett paused. He is currently being processed on federal wire fraud and money laundering charges. The Cayman account has been flagged for international asset recovery. It will take time, but the money is traceable. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a single boat moved across the far end of the lake, slow and small against the width of the water. I thought about Vivienne sitting in that sedan. I thought about what she would learn in the next 48 hours, that her husband was not her husband, that her estate claim was void, that the man she had left for, and with whom she had planned and conspired and placed her entire future, had been robbing her for over a year. I thought about what it must feel like to have built an entire architecture of betrayal, only to discover that the ground beneath it had been eroded from 2 directions simultaneously. I did not feel satisfaction about that. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something quieter and more austere, a recognition that the consequences of what Vivienne and Garrett and Damon had set in motion were not something I had manufactured. They were simply the natural results of choices freely made, arriving on their own schedule, as they always eventually do. The trial took 11 weeks. King County Superior Court Department, 9, Judge Patricia Alderman presiding. The prosecution presented the watch recordings, the camera footage, the 2 poison compounds, and their toxicology analysis. The chain of custody for both bottles, the wire transfer records, the authenticated divorce decree, and the testimony of Dr. Sandra Merritt, Detective Ray Dunbar, Marcus Elroy, and a forensic chemist from the University of Washington, who explained to the jury, in terms any person could follow, exactly what the second compound would have done to a 57-year-old man's system over a sustained 10 to 12-day accelerated dosing period. Ruth Stapleton testified on the 4th day. Ruth was 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher from the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, and she had been the Holt's neighbor for 11 years before I left. She had heard things over those years, conversations through walls, arguments through windows, things she had told herself were not her business and had carried in silence for a long time. Bennett had located her through a background search 6 months prior, and she had agreed to testify with the kind of quiet, resolute courage that belongs to people who have waited too long to say something true and have finally decided that the waiting itself has become its own form of harm. She took the stand in a blue cardigan and sensible shoes, and she told the court what she had heard and seen during the years she lived 40 feet from the Holt household in Boston. And when the defense attorney cross-examined her and suggested that her memory might be imperfect, after so many years, she looked at him steadily over the railing and said, "There are things a person doesn't forget, counselor. This was one of them." The jury deliberated for 2 days and 4 hours. Vivienne Ashworth was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit first-degree assault, 2 counts of unlawful delivery of a controlled substance, and criminal fraud under RCW 9A.6 0.020, which covered both her misrepresentation of marital status and the fabricated stage 3 cancer diagnosis she had used to gain entry to my home and establish sympathetic grounds for her estate claim. The medical fraud had been a calculated instrument from the beginning, and the prosecution treated it as such. Judge Alderman sentenced her to 25 years with eligibility for parole review after 18. The sentence was in the upper range of the applicable guidelines, and Judge Alderman stated in her sentencing remarks that the sustained and premeditated nature of the conduct, combined with the deliberate exploitation of a familial relationship as a vehicle for the crime, warranted the upper end of the range. Garrett entered a guilty plea on the second day of trial in exchange for a reduced charge of conspiracy to commit second-degree assault. His cooperation with the prosecution, specifically his testimony regarding the sourcing of the second compound, which led investigators to a private chemical supplier operating without a DEA schedule. One license in Tacoma resulted in a sentence of 8 years, with mandatory participation in a rehabilitation program. He did not look at me when the plea was entered. I did not look away from him. Damon Ford was convicted in federal court 3 months later on wire fraud and money laundering charges. He received 12 years. Sienna. His new partner, a woman. Ray's team had identified as the account holder for one of the Cayman-linked shell companies, cooperated with federal prosecutors, and received a suspended sentence in exchange for full testimony. The $1.2 million was substantially recovered through the asset freeze Bennett and the DEA had coordinated in the hours following Damon's detention at PDX. On the last day of the trial, after Judge Alderman delivered the sentence and the courtroom began its slow dissolution into motion and noise, Bennett leaned toward me and said quietly, "It held. Every piece of it held." I nodded. I looked at Wren beside me. She was looking at the front of the courtroom, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed and still, and carrying the particular expression of someone who has arrived at the end of something very long and is only now beginning to understand what standing on the other side of it feels like. I reached over and covered her hands with mine. Outside the courthouse on 3rd Avenue, the Seattle afternoon was overcast and cool. The clouds low and closed the way they get in October, the city going about its business in the street below the steps, with the complete indifference to individual human drama that cities do so well, and that I had always in my better moments found more comforting than cold. A reporter called my name from the bottom of the steps, then another. I stopped on the top step and looked out at the street and the gray sky and the ordinary motion of the city, and I thought about an $8 pocket watch bought in a Denver pawn shop in the winter of 2019 by a man who had nothing but a duffel bag and a patent sketch, and the stubborn conviction that the truth given enough time and enough careful attention tends to find its own way to the surface. I thought about what Bennett had said. Every piece of it held. I put my hand in my jacket pocket and felt the watch. There I had not worn it on my wrist that day, had carried it loose in my pocket, the way you carry something that has done its work and earned a kind of rest, and I held it for a moment in my palm, feeling the familiar weight of it, the worn brass housing, the small engraving on the back. Then I took Wren's arm, and we walked down the steps together, and did not stop for the reporters, and did not answer the questions called after us, and did not look back. And the city received us the way it receives everyone, without ceremony, without judgment, simply as two more people moving through it, on an ordinary October afternoon, going wherever they were going next. The media found the story on a Monday morning, 3 days after sentencing. I had expected it sooner, which told me that the court's information management had held longer than I anticipated. A minor technical victory that bought us 72 hours of ordinary life before the story moved from courthouse records into the national news cycle, which is the particular kind of velocity that a case involving a billionaire, a poisoning scheme, a forged marital identity, and a man detained at an airport with $62,000 in cash tends to generate without any encouragement. By Tuesday, it was on the front page of the Seattle Times. By Wednesday, it had been picked up by CNN, the Washington Post, and 3 financial news outlets whose primary interest was not in the human dimensions of what had happened, but in the question of what it meant for Holt Dynamics, its stock price, and its succession structure. The answer to that question, as George Tabor communicated in a press statement drafted in coordination with Bennett and released Wednesday afternoon, was that Holt Dynamics remained fully operational, that its leadership structure was unchanged, and that all legal matters pertaining to the criminal proceedings were entirely separate from the company's corporate governance. The stock dipped 4% on Wednesday morning and recovered 6% by Friday close, which was the market's way of deciding that the story was personal rather than structural and therefore not its primary concern. I did not speak to the press, not once, not a single sentence beyond what Bennett's prepared statements contained. This was a deliberate choice, and not a difficult one. I had spent 5 years being invisible to the world and 2 years being very visible, and I had learned the difference between the kind of attention that serves a purpose and the kind that simply consumes one. What had happened in the Medina House and in King County Superior Court was not a story I owed anyone. It was mine and Wren's, and to the extent that it belonged to anyone else, it belonged to the people who had made it necessary, and they had already received everything that was coming to them. The Damon Ford coverage was in its own way the most instructive part of the media cycle. The wire fraud and money laundering story ran separately from the poisoning case handled by the federal court's press office, and it attracted a different kind of attention, quieter, more analytical, the kind of coverage that appears in financial crime sections rather than front pages. Damon had been before all of this a moderately successful commercial real estate broker, operating between Portland and Seattle, with a reputation for charm and a history of relationships with women of significant financial means. The federal investigation, once it opened and the 3 shell companies were fully mapped, revealed a pattern that predated his relationship with Vivienne by nearly a decade, 4 previous instances of financial extraction from former partners, none of which had resulted in prosecution because none of the women had known what to look for or had possessed the resources to find it. Sienna's cooperation had been the decisive factor. She was 29, had met Damon 18 months prior, and had believed until Ray's team contacted her that the account she held in her name was a legitimate investment vehicle. When she understood what it actually was and what exposure she carried for holding it, she had called a federal public defender within the hour and agreed to full cooperation before the end of the same day. Her testimony mapped every transfer, every shell company, every transaction, with a precision that federal prosecutors described in their post-conviction statement as the most complete financial cooperation they had received in a wire fraud case in 3 years. I felt something for Sienna that I had not expected to feel, not sympathy exactly, but a kind of recognition. She had been used as a vehicle for someone else's design, without fully understanding what she was part of. That was a specific kind of harm, quiet and corrosive. And the fact that she had acted immediately and completely when the truth was laid in front of her said something about her character that the circumstances of her involvement did not. Vivienne learned about the full extent of Damon's extraction during the trial's discovery phase, when the wire transfer records were submitted as evidence in both her case and his. Her attorney had informed me through Bennett that her response upon reviewing the financial records had been, and I was given this description by a court officer who was present, a long and absolute silence, followed by a statement that her attorney had advised her not to repeat, and that therefore I will not record here. Whatever she felt in that moment, I did not need to know the specifics of it to understand its shape. She had gambled everything on a future that had already been systematically stolen from her by the man she had chosen over the life she had. That was not justice exactly, but it was consequence, which is what justice most often looks like up close. 3 weeks after sentencing, I established the Wren Holt Foundation. The foundation's stated purpose was threefold: to provide legal and financial advocacy resources to individuals who had experienced familial financial abuse, to fund educational scholarships for students who had been removed from academic programs due to family-related financial instability, and to support early-stage rehabilitation programs for nonviolent offenders with documented histories of financial coercion. The third purpose was Wren's addition. I had presented her with the first 2, and she had listened carefully and then said quietly that she thought there should be a third, and she told me what it was, and I looked at her for a long moment and said yes. Marcus Elroy contributed the first endowment, $3 million transferred without condition, and issued a brief public statement saying only that the foundation addressed a category of harm that had been systematically underfunded for too long. Bennett Cross agreed to serve on the board without compensation. George Tabor built the foundation's operational infrastructure in 6 weeks, and on the morning of the public launch, he sent me a message at 7 a.m. that said, "Site is live. Everything is running." I forwarded it to Wren without comment. She replied with 2 words, "Thank you, Dad." I read those 2 words standing in the kitchen of the Medina House on a gray November morning, the lake flat and pewter-colored outside the window, the coffee maker cycling on behind me, the house quiet and ordinary, and entirely mine again, in all the ways that mattered. I read them twice. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and stood at the window for a while watching the water. The herons were back in the shallows below the property, 2 of them moving along the shoreline with the same unhurried patience I had watched from this same window on the morning before everything came apart. They moved through the shallow water, as if time were not a pressure, but a medium, as if the distance between where they were and where they needed to be was simply a matter of continuing to move forward without flinching. I watched them until my coffee went cold. Then I picked up the pocket watch from the kitchen counter where I had set it that morning. Not on my wrist today, just carried the way you carry something that belongs to you, without needing to wear it as armor anymore, and I held it in my palm for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it against my skin. $8 from a pawn shop on Colfax Avenue in the worst winter of my life. I had bought it because I needed something that kept time, and that was all I could afford. It had kept time faithfully ever since through everything, and in the end, it had done more than keep time. It had made sure the truth had a witness. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and went to find Ren. This is my family story. Not the version I would have chosen, but it is mine, and I have made my peace with it. If I have learned anything from this family betrayal, it is this. It does not destroy you unless you let it define you. I waited too long to understand that. Don't be like me. The moment you know something is wrong, trust it. Document everything. And find the people who will stand beside you when everything falls apart. I believe God does not waste suffering. Every year I lost was quietly building something I could not yet see. I hold on to that. My honest opinion, patience without strategy is just waiting. But patience with truth, with preparation, with evidence, that is how a family betrayal becomes a family story worth surviving, worth telling. And this particular family story, with all its betrayal, its silence and its long, slow reckoning, ends not with anger, but with Ren beside me and the truth finally where it belongs. If this story found you at the right moment, leave a comment. I read everyone. If it moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to be here for what comes next, subscribe. You already know where to find us. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for meaningful educational storytelling. If that is not for you, no hard feelings. Step away and find what serves you better. But if you are still here, I will see you in the next one.